Lingue originali.
Bentornati a Lingue originali e in particolare all'episodio dedicato alla letteratura in lingua inglese. Ultimo appuntamento con Alan Bennett, o almeno con una delle opere di Alan Bennett, The Uncommon Reader. La sovrana lettrice è il titolo dell'edizione italiana pubblicato da Adelphi. La traduzione letterale in realtà è l'insolita lettrice. Insolita perché? Perché parliamo della regina Elisabetta. Più insolita di così? Alan Bennett, scrittore, drammaturgo, sceneggiatore e anche attore inglese. Personalità dall'umanità spiccata e nello stesso tempo dotata di uno spietato e tagliente umorismo. Non so se avete ascoltato le letture tratte dalla raccolta Talking Heads, che è diventato alla fine degli anni '80 anche un caso televisivo sugli schermi della BBC. Leggemmo un po' di queste novelle che trovate insieme agli episodi precedenti dedicati a The Uncommon Reader sul podcast e sul canale YouTube di Caffè Italia. Alan Bennett, insegnante di storia che a un certo punto lascia la cattedra e si dedica innanzitutto al teatro e poi alla sceneggiatura, sempre per il teatro ma anche per la televisione. La sovrana lettrice, dicevo, a beneficio di chi ci raggiunga soltanto in zona Cesarini al 90° minuto, per usare un gergo calcistico, Elisabetta II che per un puro accidente ha scoperto quegli oggetti strani che sono i libri e non può più farne a meno. Ma non solo, cerca di trasmettere quello che potremmo definire il virus della lettura a chiunque incontri sul suo cammino. È un libro che davvero suggerisco, io l'ho letto nell'edizione italiana, La sovrana lettrice per Adelphi. È grazioso però, è anche semplice nella versione originale per chi voglia fare pratica con l'inglese. Questo è l'ultimo episodio. Dal prossimo conosceremo un altro testo, sempre con Marco Piovaz su Caffè Italia, Marco Piovaz, al quale cedo il microfono.
Every Tuesday evening, the Queen saw her Prime Minister, who briefed her on what he felt she ought to know. The press were fond of picturing these meetings as those of a wise and experienced monarch guiding her First Minister past possible pitfalls and drawing on her unique repository of political experience accumulated over the 50-odd years she had been on the throne in order to give him advice. This was a myth, though one in which the palace itself collaborated. The truth being, the longer they were in office, the less the prime ministers listened, and the more they talked, the Queen nodding assent, though not always agreement. To begin with, prime ministers wanted the Queen to hold their hand, and when they came to see her, it was to be stroked and given an approving pat in the spirit of a child wanting to show its mother what it had done. And, as so often with her, it was really a show that was required, a show of interest, a show of concern. Men, and this included Mrs. Thatcher, wanted show. At this stage, though, they still listened and even asked her advice. But as time passed, all her prime ministers modulated with disturbing similarity into lecturing mode, when they ceased to require encouragement from the Queen, but treated her like an audience, listening to her no longer on the agenda. It was not only Gladstone who addressed the Queen as if she was a public meeting. The audience this particular Tuesday had followed the usual pattern, and it was only when it was drawing to a close that the Queen managed to get a word in and talk about a subject that actually interested her. About my Christmas broadcast. Yes, ma'am, said the Prime Minister. I thought this year one might do something different. Different, ma'am? Yes. If one were to be sitting on a sofa reading, or even more informally, be discovered by the camera curled up with a book, the camera could creep in, is that the expression, until I'm in mid-shot, when I could look up and say, I've been reading this book about such and such, and then go on from there. And what would the book be, ma'am? The Prime Minister looked unhappy. That one would have to think about. Something about the state of the world, perhaps? He brightened. Possibly, though they get quite enough of that from the newspaper. No, I was actually thinking of poetry. Poetry, ma'am? He smiled thinly. Thomas Hardy, for instance. I read an awfully good poem of his the other day about how the Titanic and the iceberg that was to sink her came together. It's called The Convergence of the Twain. Do you know it? I don't, ma'am. But how would it help? Help whom? Well, and the Prime Minister seemed a trifle embarrassed actually to have to say it, the people. Oh, surely, said the Queen, it would show, wouldn't it, that fate is something to which we are all subject. She gazed at the Prime Minister, smiling helpfully. He looked down at his hands. I'm not sure that is a message the government would feel able to endorse. The public must not be allowed to think the world could not be managed. That way lay chaos, or default at the polls, which was the same thing. I'm told, and now it was his turn to smile helpfully, that there is some excellent footage of Your Majesty's visit to South Africa. The Queen sighed and pressed the bell. We will think about it. The Prime Minister knew that the audience was over as Norman opened the door and waited. So this, thought the Prime Minister, is the famous Norman. Oh, Norman, said the Queen, the Prime Minister doesn't seem to have read Hardy. Perhaps you could find him one of our old paperbacks on his way out. Slightly to her surprise, the Queen did, after a fashion, get her way, and though she was not curled up on the sofa, but seated at her usual table, and though she did not read the Hardy poem, rejected as not forward-looking, she began her Christmas broadcast with the opening paragraph of A Tale of Two Cities. It was the best of times, it was the worst of times, and did it well too. Choosing not to read from the autocue, but from the book itself, she reminded the older ones in her audience, and they were the majority, of the kind of teacher some of them could still remember, and who had read to them at school. Encouraged by the reception given to her Christmas broadcast, she persisted with her notion of reading in public. And late one night, as she closed her book on the Elizabethan settlement, it occurred to her to ring the Archbishop of Canterbury. There was a pause while he turned down the TV. Archbishop, why do I never read the lesson? I beg your pardon, ma'am. In church, everybody else gets to read, and one never does. It's not laid down, is it? It's not off limits. Not that I am aware, ma'am. Good. Well, in that case, I'm going to start. Leviticus, here I come. Good night. The Archbishop shook his head and went back to Strictly Come Dancing. But thereafter, particularly when she was in Norfolk and even in Scotland, Her Majesty began to do a regular stint at the lectern, and not merely the lectern. Visiting a Norfolk primary school, she sat down on a classroom chair and read a story from Baba to the children. Addressing a city banquet, she treated them to a Betjeman poem, impromptu departures from her schedule, which enchanted everyone except Sir Kevin, from whom she hadn't bothered to get clearance. Also unscheduled was the conclusion of a tree-planting ceremony. Having lightly dug an oak, sapling into the reclaimed earth of a bleak urban farm above the Medway, she rested on the ceremonial spade and recited by heart Philip Larking's poem, The Trees, with its final verse. Yet still the unresting castles thresh, in full-grown thickness every May. Last year is dead, they seem to say. Begin afresh, afresh, afresh. And as that clear and unmistakable voice carried over the shabby, wind-bitten grass, it seemed it was not just the huddled municipal party she was addressing, but herself too. It was her life she was calling upon. The new beginning, hers. Still, though reading absorbed her, what the Queen had not expected was the degree to which it drained her of enthusiasm for anything else. It's true that at the prospect of opening yet another swimming baths, her heart didn't exactly leap up, but even so, she had never actually resenting having to do it. However tedious her obligations had been, visiting this, conferring that, boredom had never come into it. This was her duty, and when she opened her engagement book every morning, it had never been without interest or expectation. No more. Now she surveyed the unrelenting progression of tours, travels, and undertakings stretching years into the future, only with dread. There was scarcely a day she could call her own, and never two. Suddenly, it had all become a drag. "Ma'am is tired," said a maid, hearing her groan at her desk. "It's time Ma'am put her feet up occasionally." But it wasn't that. It was reading, and love it though she did. There were times when she wished she had never opened a book and entered into other lives. It had spoiled her, or spoiled her for this, anyway.
Sul canale streaming di Caffè Italia, il venerdì, il sabato e la domenica alle 22 con Marco Piovaz, Nadia Meroni e Barbara Marchand. E sempre comunque, quando volete, sul podcast e sul canale YouTube di Caffè Italia, Lingue Originali. Un'idea di Barbara Marchand per promuovere l'ascolto e la lettura di testi nella lingua originale degli autori. Con Dario Albertini, nella puntata dedicata all'inglese e al tedesco, a introdurre e a ricoprire il ruolo di facilitatore, diciamo così, per chi magari non è pratico della lingua nella quale andremo poi a leggere con i nostri lettori. Vi ringrazio per l'ascolto, ringrazio Marco Piovaz. Come dicevo prima della lettura, scopriremo un nuovo testo a partire dal prossimo episodio. Vi aspetto per una nuova puntata di Lingue Originali.
Lingue Originali.